Hi, I'm Professor McCoy, and today we're going to talk a little bit about some classical metaphysics, specifically the doctrine of the convertibility of the transcendentals. Now, specifically today, I'm going to talk about the convertibility of being and goodness, since the doctrine of the convertibility of the transcendentals developed later in the medieval period with the scholastics, developing on ancient thought. What that was is that all transcendental qualities, so all qualities that can be considered a perfection as such, being, goodness, beauty, existence, intelligence, knowledge, all of these things, at their utmost and ultimate form, were convertible with each other, meaning they ultimately amount to the same thing. This has things to do with especially the doctrine of divine simplicity, but that's far beyond what I want to talk about today. For today, I just want to talk about two of these, being on the one hand and goodness on the other. This first appears in the works of Plato, and therefore probably in some of the teachings of Socrates. What this means is that for something to be at all, is for it to be good insofar as it exists. So this might seem a bit complicated, but really, I find a simple example might clarify. So suppose you were to make a sandwich, and you were to put all the pieces together and you'd make this new thing which didn't exist before, called a sandwich. Before, all you had was bread, condiments, and various bits of filling. So after you put it all together, you have this new thing, which is a sandwich, which is good. Right? It's a good sandwich. You can eat it. It is good for eating. It's good for health, maybe, all that. So then suppose further that you get busy. You have to do something else before you eat it. Right? So you leave it on the counter, thinking you'll come back to it in 5 minutes. Right? Maybe someone rings the doorbell or something. So after you've answered the door and you've come back, maybe then the sandwich isn't. Maybe some of the condiments have gotten have warmed up a little bit. Maybe the tomatoes got warm. Maybe the mustard soaked into the bread, not quite how you want it to, right? So the bread's kind of soggy. So it's less good of a sandwich, right? It's not as good of a sandwich now, but it's still a sandwich. But then suppose you get distracted again, and so you've got to go do something, and you completely forgot about your sandwich. You leave it on the counter. And suppose you come back tomorrow to have a look at your sandwich. Well, at this point, it's hard to quite consider it a sandwich. Because part of what it is for this thing on the counter to be a sandwich is for it to be edible, right? A sandwich is for eating. It's something that you eat. It's food. But if it's been sitting out on the counter, especially if it's, like, say, warm out, so if your sandwich with meat on it's been sitting there for over a day, it's probably not going to be edible. Or at least your mother wouldn't think it was edible. So it's not only less good of a sandwich, like it was after you left it for a few minutes, but it's now less of a sandwich. It's harder to consider the thing a sandwich at all. Now suppose that maybe you get distracted again before throwing it away, or maybe you're just morbidly curious about what this thing will do, so you decide to leave it there on the counter for another 3 months. What do you have then? Well, at that point, you'll have, first of all, a horrendous smell, accompanied by a pile of mold and various bits that you don't want to consider. Right? So you have on the counter a piece of horrifically inedible trash that is certainly not a sandwich. So what I mean to point out here is that as you let this sandwich, this perfectly good thing, sit out, and as it gets worse and worse and worse, it also stops being the thing that it was. So it was a sandwich, now it's not a sandwich. Now it's just trash, which is worse than a sandwich. It's not as good a thing for you, especially if you're, say, considering it under the aegis of eating, right, of food. It's certainly not as good of food. So why is this important? Well, this has a lot of implications, not only for metaphysics, but for ethics. For instance, as I'll probably discuss in more detail in another video, Plato uses this to great effect when he points out that a person is a good person when that person is just. That's how we understand a good person. And to harm something is to make something worse off, right? Is to make something less. It's to diminish it. That's what it is to harm something, right? Like, so if I were to, harm my chair, one way of harming the chair would be to lean and rock around too much and it breaks, right? So it would be less of a functioning chair. So for what Plato is pointing out is that by harming someone, what that means is you're making them less of a person, less well off as a person, and so you're making them less just. So what he concludes from this, in short, I may lay this out in more detail later, but what he concludes from this is that it cannot be just to harm a person, since that would be using justice to cause someone else to be unjust. And justice can't cause its opposite. So, this also gets developed later on, especially by St. Augustine of Hippo, who was one of the earlier Christians to adopt Platonism, or a lot of tenets of Platonism. And he adopted this model of metaphysics, and he formulated it in the inverse. He did so by describing, rather than describing good as being or as existence. Hi Turbo. Instead of that, he described evil as the lack of good, or as a privation. The Latin term being privatio boni, or the privation of good, as a definition of evil. So what does this mean? What does this do? Well, Augustine and a lot of the early Christians especially were concerned with God, who's supposed to be all good, being the author of evil, or causing evil to exist. But if we understand that to be is to be good, so if good and being are convertible, and then subsequently evil is merely a privation, it's a lack of good where good ought to be, then evil as such does not exist, since it is simply non-existence. Right? So this is the same question of what is a hole. Say if I had a hole in my shirt, right? Then that would mean that there is a lack of a bit of shirt where there should be shirt. Right? So you can say, well, what is a hole? Well, it's a lack. You can't scientifically measure it other than saying, well, here's the gap between shirt and shirt. What is it? Well, it's nothing. Augustine, following Plato, described evil this way. And so what is the cause of nothing? Well, nothing. Nothing causes nothing, because nothing doesn't need a cause, right? So what this means is that any evil, so to speak, that we see is really just a recognition that things are not existing to their fullest extent. Things aren't perfect. Things aren't as good as they could be. So, what this means is that they don't require something to cause them to be deficient. Rather, they require something that causes them to be up to the point where they are. Right? So, for instance, there's some construction going on in our neighborhood. There's new houses being built. it would seem pretty inappropriate to ask, well, why is that house down the street missing its roof? Well, it's not missing its roof. At least understanding that it's in construction. The builders haven't put the roof on the house yet. So it's not a house that has had its roof taken off of it, but rather it's a house that's incomplete. And so this is understanding this bit of metaphysics here, this at least classical metaphysics. This is how we ought to look at things that are deficient as incomplete, not full. So we can look at things in terms of what ought they to be, or what would they be if they existed fully. So hopefully this very basic bit of metaphysics can actually can help understand some other complex issues, especially when reading or when talking about classical thinkers, so the ancients up through most of the medieval tradition, because this is an assumption. This is an assumption that's going through, that's underlying most of their thought, and thus, because a lot of modern thought is based on ancient thought, this is an assumption that underlies even a lot of modern thinking. So hopefully we learned something from this video, and hopefully you've been enjoying them, and hopefully we can keep this up. So I will see you next time.